Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the forum at the Kennedy School of Government. Tonight, we are going to have a moderated question and answer session with two former senior policymakers from both the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration. And in a kind of unique format, it's going to be a question and answer session in responding to questions from two students, one former student and one current student. This session this evening is a joint affair co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, the Harvard International Affairs Council, and the Women in International Security. At this time, I'd like to introduce our guests, who will be our panelists for tonight. The first is Dr. Ash Carter. I think you all know him. He served as the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy during President Clinton's first term, and while there was responsible primarily for countering weapons of mass destruction worldwide and oversight of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. He was also instrumental in removing all nuclear weapons from the territories of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, and managed the multi-billion-dollar cooperative threat reduction, otherwise known as the Nunn-Lugar program. Just to make sure that we have balance in tonight's perspective, we've invited Ambassador Robert Joseph, who recently retired in March as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. He served from November 2004 until March 2007. He was responsible as the principal State Department representative for all things nuclear, non-proliferation, and arms control, and he had previously served on the National Security Council as the Special Assistant to the President and the Senior Director for Proliferation Strategy, Counterproliferation, and Homeland Defense. So we're very happy to have him here today. I told you at the outset that the arrangements for the forum are a little bit different than we normally have. You know, normally we have one primary speaker and you're preached to, and then you get to ask questions yourselves. Tonight, however, maybe in spirit of the forthcoming 2008 presidential debates, we've arranged a format that'll be a little bit more interactive and also gives our guests the opportunity to maybe polish their political skills if they're deciding to make a run in 2008 themselves. So to give you a brief idea, we're going to have 5 rounds of questions, and the initial question, which will be posed by one of our Kennedy School students, will go to one of the former policymakers here. Then we'll have a follow-up and a chance at retort. You'll see that this will not only be fairly challenging for the moderator, but will also be fairly challenging for the policymakers themselves because we have some tough questioners here who have some tough questions. Just so you know, our guests don't know what the questions are, so this isn't a pre-cooked affair. Just very briefly, I'd like to introduce the students and former students who put this together. And you should give them a special round of applause at the end because this is their idea. They put the whole thing together, recruited the guests, and came up with the format, which I think is a very interesting way to illuminate this topic. Manjana is a trained lawyer in Germany, which is no easy thing when you've passed all the Staatsexamen. She's also now the director of the Center for Strategic and Global Affairs, which is a new think tank that she's taking a role in developing in Germany. It's very interesting. And as I said, she is a former MPP and graduated in 2007. Some of you may know Jason Blackstock. He has his PhD in physics, is also a senior fellow at the Trudeau Center, and is a current KSG student. He's going to be graduating this spring. Okay, so I think you get the situation. I'm going to give you a little bit of context, and then we're going to launch into the question and answer session. In the late 1990s, non-proliferation advocates around the world were celebrating. The end of the Cold War had reduced nuclear tensions and produced the first tangible stages of great power disarmament. In the early 1990s, had seen a number of states voluntarily give up their nuclear weapons, including South Africa, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. In 1995, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, was extended indefinitely, and by 1999, the NPT membership had grown from 140, which it was in 1990, to 187 ratified members, almost the whole planet. At the turn of the century, hopes were high that the spread of nuclear weapons had been contained. However, almost 8 years later, this optimism seems long forgotten. In 2003, North Korea became the first state to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in 2006, detonated a nuclear weapon. In 2004, it was confirmed that a black market network headed by the Pakistani nuclear scientist A.Q. Khan had been selling nuclear technologies to several member states for more than a decade. And by 2005, many of the treaty members believed that the process of great power disarmament had stalled. Some even argued that it was being reversed, and that the 2005 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which was the 10-year anniversary of the treaty's indefinite extension, broke down without any agreement on issues between the parties. It's only a fraction of the challenges that are facing the non-proliferation regime today. So, with that context, gentlemen, we now turn to you for your opening questions. In light of these trends over the past 2 decades, what do you see as the future for the non-proliferation trading regime in 5 years, in 10 years, and how important is this future to the security of the United States of America? Ambassador Joseph, we'll give you the first take at that.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this very impressive forum, and of course it's always great to see my friend and colleague for, I think now 15 years, working on very difficult issues together. Professor Carter has made an enormous contribution to our nation's security, both through his public service as well as through his teaching, and it's an honor to be here tonight with you, Ash. First, let me take issue with the premise as you've sketched it out. I think that this notion that we were ready to begin to celebrate the triumph of the traditionalist non-proliferation agenda at the end of the 1990s is a bit out of alignment with the facts. In 1999 and in the year 2000, Iran had, of course, embarked on a program to enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. Construction at Natanz had begun. This is a massive facility that will house, they have now declared 54,000 centrifuges. They had begun construction, I believe, on the facility at Isfahan to convert yellowcake into UF6 to run in the centrifuge cascades. Planning, if not groundbreaking, was well along on their heavy water production facility. Iran was clearly, though it was unknown, embarked on a massive effort to acquire a nuclear capability. North Korea, in 1999 and the year 2000, had accepted an offer of assistance that prolonged the life of the regime, in exchange for shutting down its plutonium production reactor, certainly a good thing. But it had shut it down in a way that basically put the reactor in storage, and as we now know, those actions were easily reversed, and they got right back into producing plutonium. North Korea also moved from a research and development effort to pursue fissile material through enrichment of uranium. And by 2002, our intelligence community assessed that effort was now at a production level, not that they had begun producing, but that they had acquired the means to begin to produce uranium in significant quantities. And of course, North Korea was plying its trade in ballistic missiles throughout this period as a principal means of delivery for nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. Libya was unknown to the world, also pursuing very actively its nuclear agenda in 1999 and the year 2000. And A.Q. Khan was at the height of his efforts to provide one-stop shopping for a nuclear weapons program, and guess who was purchasing North Korea, Iran, and Libya. So you had, I think, threats to the regime, both in terms of state and the newer phenomenon of non-state actors. Today, A.Q. Khan is out of business, at least for now. The Libyan nuclear program is now stored in Tennessee. So there have been, I think, significant non-proliferation successes. We've also, I think very importantly, begun to put in place new mechanisms different from the traditional non-proliferation approach, mechanisms that include the Proliferation Security Initiative to disrupt the trade in proliferation, which played a major role in the Libyan decision to denuclearize. The more recent global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism, which now has over 60 partners committed to preventing and protecting against and responding to acts of nuclear terrorism, an effort that we co-lead with Russia. We've also expanded the CTR program and the DOE non-proliferation assistance programs, and not only have we approached that through record U.S. spending in order to secure and eliminate materials, but we've internationalized that effort through the G8, an effort that has resulted in commitments of over $7 billion of non-U.S. taxpayers' money going for prevention. So I think the picture is a bit more complex. I better get to answering the question. I am going to run out of time. So moving to the challenges to the NPT regime, and I'll speed up the pace. My second point is that, whatever your assessment might be of where we were in 1999 or the year 2000, today we are faced with major challenges to the viability of the non-proliferation regime. I think primarily as a result of the challenges from Iran and North Korea. And if we fail with Iran and North Korea, we will very likely light the fuse for further proliferation. In terms of Iran, we've had statements from Saudi Arabia, statements from Turkey, statements from Egypt, all proclaiming an interest in nuclear energy. Well, these statements may, in fact, indicate something beyond an interest in nuclear energy. With regard to North Korea, if we're unsuccessful in denuclearizing North Korea, then I think the future is very unclear with South Korea and Japan, two countries that have the capability to acquire nuclear weapons. They simply lack the political will. If we're going to be successful in preventing the unraveling of the NPT regime, a regime that is very important to our interests, we need to begin to take actions now. The President gave a speech in February of 2004 that outlined 7 different approaches to strengthening the NPT regime, including ensuring that the additional protocol was or became a requirement for the trade in proliferation. The trade in nuclear energy equipment and technologies. The principal element of the President's proposal was the effort to stop the transfer of enrichment and reprocessing technologies to states that do not already possess those capabilities. And that's an effort that we have well underway, and it has evolved into an effort, again, with Russia, to shape the future of the nuclear enterprise, not to try to stop the growth of nuclear energy, but actually facilitate that growth, but in a way that is more conducive, not just to our energy security requirements or our environmental goals, but in a way that is more proliferation resistant. The third point that I would make is that the NPT is a vitally important element of our strategy, but it's only one element. We've got to do everything we can in the context of prevention, and that's really where the NPT regime helps. But we've also got to focus on protection, because we will not always be successful in stopping proliferation, and we need to focus on response, including responding to such threats as terrorists with dirty bombs. Let me just stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador Joseph, very much. Dr. Carter? The future of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, 5 years, 10 years, how important?
Okay, same question to me. First of all, let me say something about the format here. I mean, this looks like a presidential debate or something, and Bob's already indicated he and I are friends. That wouldn't stop us from debating, but there is something else going on here, which is the title of this forum is, I think something like, can the United States save the non-proliferation regime? Well, first of all, the United States can't save the non-proliferation regime by itself because it's mostly about other people. We have nuclear weapons, they don't. And it's about them continuing not to have nuclear weapons. We contribute to that, but at the end of the day, it's in the hands of others, and we have influence but not control. It's not surprising that non-proliferation has been a bipartisan policy of the United States since Eisenhower. So this isn't an issue, a lot of national security gets made partisan almost gratuitously these days in the United States. This is an issue where there has been a bipartisan consensus in the United States. Now, that isn't to say that I don't think that the Bush administration has made mistakes. I'll say what they are. But not everything they've done is a mistake. And I'll also say that a lot of the good stuff that they've done because Bob was in there. Bob and I worked together for a long time in the Pentagon together. I've worked for administrations of both parties in the Pentagon, so has Bob. The only morally questionable thing that he's ever done is work in the State Department for a period of time. But that's over now, and we're learning to forgive him for doing that. But
we are in agreement on that point.
So that's what fundamentally underlying this quasi-debate is going to be some issues where he and I will disagree, but fundamentally it's in the U.S. interest to keep this non-proliferation thing going. We don't control it. Some of the factors that seem to be threatening it now have been cited, but not all of them. The runaway North Korean program, which is a disaster. Which I'm not sure will be reversed. Iran, which seems to be heading the same way. But there are some other things going on. Oh, the AQCON network also, and the kind of underworld and international brotherhood of rogues that seem to work together and cooperatively on this stuff with one another. There's some other things going on. One is the spread of nuclear power. I don't know how you think about that in this audience, but many people think that nuclear power will be an ingredient, not a decisive ingredient, but an important ingredient in dealing with the energy crisis and its climate consequences and so forth. If you believe that and you envision nuclear power spreading around the world, you are also envisioning the possibility that in its wake will spread reprocessing and enrichment capability, and therefore the inherent capacity to make nuclear weapons. In short, proliferation under the guise of the spread of energy. That would be a very dangerous thing. The speech that President Bush gave in November of 2004, which of course Bob Joseph wrote. When somebody who was in government says the president gave a speech on a certain date and said a certain thing, that means they wrote that speech. And Bob did. It's an excellent speech. And President Bush called attention to this problem. That's another biggie out there. But the erosion of the non-proliferation regime, if it's going to take place, comes from two sources. Who's out there disparaging the non-proliferation regime, other than the North Korea and Iran? The very few out of 200-odd countries, the very few troublemakers, so to speak. Most countries are fine not having nuclear weapons. Two sources of criticism. One are the countries that say, hey, look, we don't have nuclear weapons, but some you, like the United States, do, and that doesn't seem fair to us, and what are you doing to make yourself more like us? That's something we ought to talk about a little bit later. I have an answer to that, to them. I think they're wrong, but we should talk about that later. The other have been some voices in our own country, and I will say your predecessor, if I may say so, John Bolton, was fond of the following critique, which I think a lot of people agree with, but or think plausible, but I don't agree with. And it goes like this. It says, what do we have the Non-Proliferation Treaty for? It says the bad guys ignore it. They either don't sign it, or they sign it and cheat, or they sign it and quit. And the good guys, of course, you don't need a treaty for. So what's the point? Sounds reasonable. But two things wrong with that. The first is that the world doesn't come in good guys and bad guys. There are actually some in-between cases. In recent history, those cases have been Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, South Korea, Taiwan, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil. that have walked up to the edge and you wouldn't characterize them as rogue states or bad guys, but they, for a serious period of time, seriously flirted with nuclear weapons. And there were many reasons why they turned away, but one of them was that they were susceptible to the argument that these weapons are so bad that everybody shouldn't have them. That's the kind of spirit of the NPT. And for those parties, it does matter that there is something called the NPT. The other way that the NPT helps is even against the bad guys, when it comes time to put pressure on the bad guys, we, the United States, are strengthened by the fact that almost all the rest of the world has also said this shouldn't happen. And so they're with us in principle as we go against North Korea, as we go against Iran. Nobody's arguing that Iran and North Korea ought to have nuclear weapons. So the NPT, yes, it's under attack, but it has it plays a role. It has a strong future. And I would say your question, 5-10 years from now, there'll be a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. I have a concern that I'll get to a little bit later about how it could unravel, and I'll describe, if we get time later in the evening, what it would look like if I'm wrong. But of course, I think I'm right. So I give myself 75% probability the NPT will be here and will look healthy, and our current hand-wringing will look, in retrospect, too dire. A 25% probability for something that'll really be scary and really be new. And if we get a little chance later in the evening, I'll describe it.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. We're now going to turn to questions from Manana and Jason. And I just wanted to point out something not in my script, but I think that you'll realize this is a Canadian and a German asking the Americans whether it's possible that the U.S. can save the regime. So this is an international affair. The first question will be from Jason to Ambassador Joseph.
That's right. Thank you, gentlemen. You've both answered the question of how important is this regime to U.S. security, and the answer is very important to prevent proliferation. And Professor Carter, you even began setting up the first question for me, which is the fact that the basic deal of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is that non-nuclear weapon states agree not to develop nuclear weapons. But the second part you left out was, in compensation, nuclear weapon states agree to, in good faith, pursue general and complete disarmament. In seeming contrast to this commitment, the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review of 2002 emphasized the critical importance of nuclear weapons and their unique properties to the U.S. defense, strategic, and political objectives. And in subsequent years, the U.S. even pursued the development of tactical nuclear weapons, the robust nuclear Earth penetrator. So, Ambassador Joseph, in this context, the first question is to you. What has been the impact of America's recent nuclear posture on international perception of the U.S. commitment to disarmament, and how has this potentially weakened the regime itself?
Let me just say one thing about the basic deal of the NPT. You're right. The basic deal of the NPT is that non-nuclear weapon states, in exchange for pledging not to acquire nuclear weapons, are allowed access to all aspects of peaceful nuclear energy, and that would include enrichment and reprocessing. The very technologies, the very capabilities that could provide the path to acquire nuclear weapons. And as Ash said, there are many countries in between, but there are also bad guys. There are countries that cynically manipulate the provisions of the NPT under the guise of peaceful programs to acquire fissile material capabilities that they will use in nuclear weapons. We've seen it with North Korea. We're watching it in slow motion. That's actually accelerating motion with Iran. And that is something that we need to look at very closely. And we are looking at that by considering such ideas and making proposals for fuel assurances, for even more sort of assistance to nuclear power programs in exchange for not pursuing enrichment and reprocessing technologies. In the context of Article 6, I think Article 6 is a very important commitment on the part of nuclear weapon states. And I think the United States has a very positive record undoubtedly the most positive record, I would say, in terms of the nuclear weapon states. And as you look at how we have drawn down on our nuclear posture, in almost whatever category you want, you mentioned theater nuclear weapons. We used to have, 7,200 theater nuclear weapons in Europe alone? Well, today we have a few hundred. And in fact, we're pretty much out of the theater nuclear business. Russia, by contrast, is producing massive numbers of theater nuclear weapons and is relying much more on nuclear weapons for its defense posture. Part of this, of course, was the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Part of it was to compensate for its conventional weaknesses, but also because they rely on nuclear weapons a great deal, and they have traditionally, and they continue to do that. China is moving forward with nuclear modernization. The United States, by contrast, in the strategic area, has drawn down. We will, through the Treaty of Moscow that was negotiated by my colleague and friend John Bolton, come to the lowest level in decades of operationally deployed strategic warheads. We do have a good record. We need to continue to move down, but in accordance with our requirements. And the key has been that this administration has taken the position that we will only deploy those weapons that are necessary for our defense requirements and for our deterrence obligations, particularly to allies. And we must remember that extended deterrence is, and our guarantee on a credible nuclear sort of assurance to countries like Japan, is a very powerful non-proliferation tool.
Jason, you have a follow-up
Just
on
a
that?
very quick follow-up on that, which is, I want to focus on the fact that the U.S. has emphasized the strategic importance of nuclear weapons for its own defense. Doesn't this undermine, to some extent, the promise that the U.S. is going to, in effect, give up any strategic advantage of nuclear weapons? Isn't that part of Article 6? That the nuclear weapon states agree to give up the strategic advantage of nuclear weapons, and re-emphasizing that undermines it.
Well, Article 6, as you say quite accurately, calls for good faith negotiations. And what general and complete disarmament means is the lamb and the lion are ready to lie down together. Okay? That is not the situation that we're in today. I don't think we're going to be in that situation in 5 years or 10 years. We do require nuclear weapons as an element of our deterrent and defense posture. But again, I would look at how that component of our defense posture plays much less of a role today than I think at any time in the last 60 years, and that the numbers, and whatever category you're talking about, whether it's theater nuclear weapons or strategic nuclear weapons or throw weight, whatever category you're talking about, we're 90% down or 95% down. It's phenomenal how far we've gone down, while the other nuclear states, in particular Russia, but also China in terms of modernization, are going the other way.
Okay. Ash, you have a 1-minute follow-up to that.
Well, a couple of things. Yeah, it's a deal between the haves and the have-nots, but it's also two other deals. It's a deal that will have not if you share technology, which Bob mentioned, but it's mostly a deal among have-nots, that I'll have not if my neighbor has not. And you really can't forget that. I know that Americans are always saying that, but it's really true. I remember in 1995, we had every 5 years you go through this agony of a review of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and all the countries come and rake the nuclear weapon states over the coals. And I went through that in 1995. Bob was working for me probably at that time. For example, the ambassador from Mexico to these talks lived in New York, and he was arguing that perhaps the Non-Proliferation Treaty shouldn't be renewed. And you say, Mexico? Can Mexico really be against the Non-Proliferation Treaty? How can it possibly be in Mexico's interest for nuclear weapons to spread all over Latin America, for example? And President Clinton called the president of Mexico and said, do you know there's a guy in New York who is arguing that Mexico might actually be against the nuclear non-proliferation? What's happening? And the president said, who is this guy? I says, I gave him his name. You remember his name. And you know, he's got a car and an apartment and the whole deal. there, and he's representing the government of Mexico. And this guy was transferred to, I think, Portugal a few days later. Right? So when real leaders, my point is, when real leaders of have-not countries ask themselves, is the nuclear nonproliferation a good thing for themselves and for humanity, they say yes. And so we shouldn't get too romanced by this idea of a deal between haves and has-not. That said, and everything Bob has said is also true, we have reduced our nuclear arsenal tremendously. So the facts are on our side. That being the case, how can we possibly have made a hash of this 2005 review? And I think it has two ingredients to it. First is a stubborn unwillingness to engage with this question, which I find exasperating, but I would have done it, number one. And number two is something that's harder, which is that the United States has lost temporarily, I believe, but some of the authority to persuade that we have traditionally had. And this is a symptom, this upset of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I associate, is a symptom of that loss of authority. I think we'll regain that authority in time. There are lots of reasons for why it's not there, but you see it in other issues as well these days, and it's part of the great project of restoration that we're going to be embarked on in coming years to re-win some of the persuasive power that the United States previously had.
Thank you both. Now moving on to round two, Manana will pose a question to Professor Carter.
Thank you. Our second question addresses international treaties and disarmament. As part of its commitment to the NPT, the US has previously promised engagement in additional international treaties. These included the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, banning all nuclear explosive tests, and bilateral treaties with Russia, for example, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties. Prior to 2001, the US had committed to each of these. But since 2001, the US has dropped out of the ABM Treaty, has allowed the START II treaty to collapse, and has, quote-unquote, unsigned the CTBT. Dr. Carter, what impact has the historic support of the US for these treaties, but the recent and current disengagement from these treaties had on the non-proliferation regime?
Well, I think that's been unfortunate. Arms control isn't a panacea. By the way, the NPT isn't a panacea either. There are lots of things we do to combat weapons of mass destruction. We have treaties, but we also have export controls. We have alliances which reassure countries that might otherwise get nuclear weapons that they're safe not having their own nuclear weapons. We build missile defenses. We have deterrent forces in case, we have lots of things that we do. And the treaty's just one of them. But this is a problem that is so dangerous that you got to do everything you can think of. And arms control is one of the things that we can think of. And under the right circumstances, it can be pretty important. Now, you mentioned arms control with Russia. I think that we would do well, and perhaps this will happen in the next year, I don't know, to go one more round with Russia. After that, it's not going to make sense to have arms control with just us and Russia anymore. The Cold War is over, and it's not going to escape people's notice that China and others are out there that are powerful and nuclear armed. So the round after this one ought to involve some others as well. So I think arms control has a future. It'll be challenging, but we ought to be on that path, not on the path of heading the other direction. And we've been on the path of heading the other direction, I would say, recently. The ABM treaty's gone, and you can argue about whether it should have been gone or not, but I think it's probably gone for good. And we will be, missile defense is now another program that will be judged about according to its effectiveness and its cost. Rather than the treaty. I don't see the ABM treaty coming back. CTBT, it probably does have a future for the following reason. That's always been a partisan issue, by the way. I don't know why, but it has. It's one of those things that each party has dug itself into a particular position on that. But the reality is that we're not going to test nuclear weapons anymore. And so the CTBT doesn't constrain us any more than we're already constraining ourselves. And so in that sense, it's cost-free. The benefit is that it shows some respect for whatever the Constitution says, to the opinions of mankind, and we could get in the business of showing some of that respect. And so my guess is that that's likely to happen.
Okay, Ambassador Joseph, you have a response?
Well, I think we do have a point of disagreement on the CTBT. The CTBT, of course, was rejected not by 34 senators, but 51 senators, including Senator Lugar, who's known to be a proponent of arms control. The argument was, of course, that as long as we need nuclear weapons as part of our defense and deterrent posture, those nuclear weapons need to be safe and reliable and effective. And we don't have a guarantee that the stockpile stewardship program will work and that at some point we will not have to test. I think the prospects of testing are low, but I think they're not insignificant. On the ABM treaty, there's a treaty that clearly had lived beyond its day. This was a treaty that enshrined the concept of mutual assured destruction between Russia and the United States. When the former Soviet Union existed as the Soviet Union, one could make the argument that there was a deterrent logic. But once the Soviet Union went away, the Cold War ended. We, I think, needed to move beyond that treaty, not just to establish a different relationship with Russia, so that nuclear weapons were no longer the single most important currency in our relationship, but we also needed to be able to respond to threats like North Korea and Iran in the future. And by ending the ABM treaty, we were able to develop capabilities against long-range missiles to protect our country, which of course was prohibited by the treaty. In terms of strategic arms control, I think they certainly did play a role, an important role in the past. I just don't think we need even another round. I think we've kind of ended that relationship with Russia. Again, we need to draw down, but we don't need this sort of, negotiators going to Geneva and the whole arms control culture, because what that does, I know this in terms of the mind of at least what was my Russian counterpart, is put us back into this sort of Cold War bipolar situation, which a number of former Soviet officials, now Russian officials, really relish. They love that idea. And I think we need to take nuclear weapons as far off the agenda as we can. Thank you.
I want to, on CTBT, yes, it was rejected. And this is something there could be a whole forum on. The reasons it was rejected were twofold. One is that the stockpile stewardship program was new and untested. And the second one was that the technology of verification was uncertain. In both of those areas, I think you'll find that the scientists who work on these issues at principally our weapons laboratories will tell you that it's a very different circumstance now. So that's why I think that if the changed circumstances are presented to someone like Dick Lugar, whom I have the greatest respect for, there's some chance that he will change his mind in those changed circumstance. I just don't agree. I think that this is where maybe it's the next round and the round after. It's not nostalgia for the past to take one more bite with the Russians, I don't think. You lock them in to a set of reductions that I think we want them to take. After that, we will be down to levels that begin to compare to the levels that China, Great Britain, France, and others have. And at that point, it doesn't make any more sense for us and the Russians to talk to one another. So I'm not afraid of making one more deal with the Russians, not because it's going to change our behavior so much as it'll lock them into a path that I want them on.
Now moving on to round 3 on the India deal. There'll be Manjana asking Ambassador Joseph.
According to a statement of Dr. Carter, one main strength of the non-proliferation regime, and I quote, is the lasting international ostracism that threatens states if they stand outside the regime. India never signed the non-proliferation treaty and openly possesses nuclear weapons. However, in 2006, the US entered into a deal with India, effectively accepting their nuclear weapons status and also providing some support for the civilian part of their program. Quoting Dr. Carter again, nuclear recognition for India suggests that forgiveness will eventually come to proliferators who wait, and tomorrow's potential proliferators might be tempted by the US-India precedent. Ambassador Joseph, what have been or will be the consequences of the US-India deal for the non-proliferation regime?
Well, just a few words about the civil nuclear agreement with India. In part, it's about nuclear energy, and I believe that nuclear energy will and should expand in both the industrialized and the industrializing countries, not just China and India in that last category. It's also about non-proliferation, and I have always been careful not to oversell the India agreement on non-proliferation grounds, but I do believe that, on balance, it is a non-proliferation plus. The Indians in the July 2005 statement that was made by the Prime Minister and the President agreed to basically end their war with the NPT. The Indians have been at war with the NPT for decades. And what the agreement does is bring India not into the NPT as a party, as a non-nuclear weapon state, but it brings it more into the mainstream of the NPT regime. And it does this in a number of ways. First, the Indians agree to separate their civilian and their military programs and to allow the IAEA to put safeguards on the civilian side. Second, the Indians agreed to adhere to the Nuclear Suppliers Group in terms of the trade in proliferation, the trade in nuclear energy materials. The Indians also agreed at that time to work with us on a fissile material cutoff treaty. They've agreed to work with us in the context of the missile technology control regime and to adopt the rules of that regime. And the Indians agreed to continue their moratorium on testing, as well as to sign and adhere to the additional protocol that gives the IAEA a lot more opportunities to work in India and verify their commitments. So, on balance, I think the agreement is good for non-proliferation. But what this agreement is really about is the future of our strategic relationship with India. India was not going to give up its nuclear weapons. Okay, they simply were not going to give up their nuclear weapons. Again, perhaps the lamb and the lion will lie down together, but that's a very dangerous region. Their view of nuclear weapons is that they're essential less for Pakistan than they are for their relationship with China. And we could continue to try to keep India off, to put them off, or we could try to bring them in, both into the regime, the NPT regime, as well as establishing a new strategic relationship with what is a very powerfully emerging country. It's not only a regional power, it's going to be a global power, as we all know. It is a large democracy that share many of our values, and we wanted to change our relationship. Remember that for 50 years or more in the Cold War, India was on the wrong side. Okay? We need to change that relationship, and the arrangement for civil nuclear energy was a means of doing that.
Quick follow-up. You said that there was a non-proliferation plus in the deal, and you emphasized the strategic value of the deal for the US. But isn't there a danger that other countries like China or Russia could maybe use this precedent and twist it to similar deals with let's say, Iran?
Well, I mean, the irony, of course, is that Iran is a member of the NPT. we've had to work in other channels to try to ensure that Iran does not acquire nuclear technologies and sensitive materials from the outside, including through PSI and through a network of international controls, the Nuclear Suppliers Group being one of them. Sure, there's always a risk. I think the risk would be greater that China might use this precedent as a means of providing nuclear technology to Pakistan. Pakistan is not a member of the NPT. Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state like India, but outside of the NPT. It has a much different record of proliferation than does India. India has a positive record of non-proliferation. Pakistan, of course, is the home of AQ-Khan. Now, our relationship with Pakistan is very complicated. Maybe there will be another Pakistan question given the current events on the ground in Pakistan. I think that is a key nuclear sort of uncertainty for the near and longer term. But yes, there's the risk, but I think it's manageable. It's manageable under the rules of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. It's manageable in how we've approached this. And remember that the day that the India agreement was announced in Washington, Dr. El-Baradei, the head of the IAEA, stepped out to the press, I was there with him, and said that he favored this agreement. It was about time. His view was, we've got, in fact, he used the expression, we've bagged about everybody we're going to bag for the NPT, okay? And Israel, India, and Pakistan being the exceptions are not likely to join, and we've got to deal with reality. He's been a very supportive voice on this agreement, as has Congress. Congress overwhelmingly passed the legislation, both parties, this is not a partisan issue, moving forward with this agreement.
Ash, you have a follow-up on that?
I supported it. I couldn't go to the lengths that Bob did, although maybe he had to, of saying it was good for non-proliferation. It's awkward for non-proliferation. And the reason that the United States did it was because it wanted to have a better relationship with India, and this was always the sticking point in our relationship with India. So here's an example of where you traded off non-proliferation, a huge, I would say the most important single national security objective, not only because you don't want states to get nuclear weapons, but you can't have terrorists get nuclear weapons from states, subject about which Professor Allison done a lot of important work. 9/11 was not just a wake-up call about terrorists with airplanes. It ought to have been about nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the hands of anybody, because terrorists can always get them. But this was a case where we traded off a non-proliferation objectives, slight harm to the tidiness of the non-proliferation regime, against something else we wanted, which was a good strategic relationship with a billion-person, talented, English-speaking country in an important part of the world. And there's no way of putting varnish on that. That's what it was. I thought that was okay, and I supported it, but I wouldn't go to the lengths of saying it was on balance good for non-proliferation.
Okay, we're going to move to the final round of questions from our panel before moving on to your questions. This is on North Korea. Jason, go ahead.
Korea. So moving from one deal that's created waves to another recent deal that's definitely created waves in the non-proliferation regime is the new deal with North Korea. We all know that North Korea dropped out in 2003 from the NPT and detonated its nuclear weapon in 2006. Between 2003 and 2006, the U.S. was relatively unwilling to strike a new nuclear deal with North Korea. They wanted a variety of concessions. But after that point in time, since 2006, the U.S. did an about-face and has negotiated what's generally perceived to be a relatively sweet deal for the North Koreans. In this context, Professor Carter, does this history and the current deal with North Korea establish the precedent that proliferators, such as Iran or North Korea, will actually be much better off once they've obtained nuclear weapons? And what has that done to the regime?
Well, this is, I have to say, is the principal area where I simply cannot fathom the behavior of the Bush administration. We have called the North Koreans the axis of evil, we have told them repeatedly that they mustn't cross a line. Remember, you don't take the plutonium out of Yongbyon. That's unacceptable, says the President of the United States. They do it, we accept it. Don't launch the Taepodong missile. That's unacceptable. They do it, we accept it. Don't test a bomb underground. They do it, we test it. So here's the worst combination of tough talk and weak action. And I've dealt with the North Koreans, and they're no delight to deal with. But they're not mysterious to deal with. We've dealt with them for 50 years in POW, MIA, DMZ affairs, and so forth. And you can't get anything out of them that way. They're going to run you over when you use that combination. And they ran us over. And North Korea, on the watch of the Bush administration after 9/11, went nuclear. North Korea, the weirdest place in the world, went nuclear. That takes my breath away, and I don't have any patience for it. Now, I think I have an explanation for it, which is not that it's Bob Joseph's fault by any means, but maybe he can tell whether this theory is right or not. I saw the administration as at war with itself, within itself, between two camps. One camp was look, they're difficult to deal with. We find their government and the way it treats its people morally repugnant, but it's more immoral to have a nuclear North Korea than it is to talk to North Korea, so let's suck it up and do it, which is what previous American administrations had done. And another point of view, which said, the North Koreans are just so odious. And Kim Jong-il is himself so odious, and of course President Bush was quoted on a number of occasions as saying as much, that, our strategy is we're just not going to talk to people like that, and we're going to hope he's going to go away. Now, to me, that hope is not a policy, a stance is not a strategy, and so to that camp, I would say, I got you. I don't like him either, but what are you going to do about nuclear weapons? I believe the president was in that second camp. And whatever he would say to the question, what are you going to do about the nuclear weapons, it seems that the answer is nothing. I'm going to let it go, because I'd rather not deal with these people, or at least make an effort to talk them out of it. I think that compromised our security. For what? For a dream that they were going to go away, and a moral stance of unwillingness to talk to bad people that I think is vastly outweighed by the immorality of letting North Korea go nuclear, which was the result. So, now I'm not saying that we could have talked them out of it. That we'll never know, because that tape will never be run. We'll never know. But we didn't give it a shot, and we gave them all the evidence that we were prepared to roll over whatever they did. And we did, and they rolled over us. And now, can we take it back, this agreement? I don't know. This is I feel like we're in so many cases these days. I look at this situation and people say, what would you do? And I say, well, if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't be in your shoes.
Ambassador Joseph, you want to respond to that?
I do want to respond to that. I don't know where to begin on this one, except I should say that I do agree with Ash. I don't support the policy, and I've said that publicly, that we are pursuing on North Korea. That doesn't mean that I don't have a sense of honor and privilege for having served in the administration. I certainly continue to have enormous respect for Secretary Rice and the President, but I don't support the North Korean policy. Then I would just say, to begin, the facts. The facts are North Korea was nuclear when the Bush administration came into office. According to the intelligence community, they had enough plutonium for 1 or 2 nuclear weapons at that time. Now they're assessed. They're assessed to have 6 to 10 to 12. I don't know what the number is. It's more, and that's not a good thing. But what is the metric of success? Because again, I would build on Ash's comment about hope is not a policy. Well, experience, I think, is a firmer ground for policy, and our experience with the North Koreans is that they cheat on every single agreement. They cheated on the North-South agreement, they cheated on the NPT, they cheated on the IAEA safeguards, and most recently they cheated on the 1994 agreed framework, which was, and I said so at the time, a house of cards. Reconstructing, this same house of cards is a policy that I simply can't support. the approach that I would think would bring the greatest security benefit is to put the pressure on North Korea, which we were doing up through last fall, particularly after the detonation of the nuclear test in October. We had measures in place that were putting a real squeeze on their financial activities, activities that include counterfeiting of our currency, drug smuggling, other illicit activities, and of course, proliferation activities. We had clamped down on those activities, and I think that, in addition to what was a reassessment, I believe, on the part of China of its strategic relationship with North Korea after the test, that brought the North Koreans back to the table. I can tell you, I went to China immediately after the test, traveling with the secretary. The Chinese were at that point willing. Not only did they go forward with the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1718, which, unlike the anemic sanctions placed on Iran, put real sanctions on North Korea, they were beginning to work with us on implementation. We were beginning to put in place a stronger PSI presence in the region. We were beginning to put in place a nuclear detection architecture that would give us a better prospect for detecting the transfer of fissile materials, which the North Koreans have said not only that they have, but that they would transfer to third parties. And we do know from experience that North Korea also sells whatever it has. So the key issue to me is not whether they have 2 or 12, much better to have 2 than 12, no question about that, but to get them out of the nuclear business, because this is a regime that will sell whatever it has and that will provide, for a price, fissile material to terrorists or to other countries. And I don't think we can take that risk, because that's the bigger risk to national security, in my view.
Thank you both very much. Now we're going to open to questions from the crowd. So if you could please walk up to the microphone if you have a question. When you go up to the microphone, please briefly introduce yourself. Just say who you are, where you're from. Then a very brief question so we can get to as many as possible. And we'll take brief answers. Also, if you could direct your question to one of our guests, that'd be helpful. Yes, ma'am.
Ambassador Joseph, Jackie Hardy, National Security Fellow. Bob, I worked for Bob for 2.5 years.
Good to see you again, Jay.
And
I
you
thought
too.
they said that there were not going to be any more planted questions in these debates.
Okay, let me answer that.
Didn't Dennis Kucinich say that?
analyst.
Next, he's going to tell you he saw a UFO.
Actually, I'm interested in what our claims about WMD in Iraq has done to our credibility in negotiating with our world partners on containing WMD worldwide.
What the effect of being wrong on Iraq?
Yes, and in claiming, such strong intelligence and background for it, what that does for, again, those similar claims to other regimes.
Well, I think it's had an important impact. It has had the effect of undercutting our credibility. But you have to remember, it wasn't just U.S. intelligence that was wrong on this. It was the intelligence agencies of every government that I know that has an intelligence agency. There was consensus, not on the nuclear part, okay, but there was consensus within our community on chemical and biological. We often hear our community was divided. Well, our community wasn't divided on chemical and biological weapons and stockpiles. And that was the position of just about everyone. So we all share in this intelligence failure, but undeniably it's had an effect, because I think it's an example of where we were wrong, and we can be wrong. Another issue that has more recently come about is this transfer of nuclear weapons from Minot, North Dakota to Barksdale. I would have told you that couldn't happen. Okay, it did happen, and I think we need to take all of these sorts of events into account in our own assessments, and just factor them in and be as prudent as we can. The evidence, I can argue, was overwhelming in both cases.
Yes, sir.
My name is Frederick Law. I'm a German Weatherhead Fellow and until recently Ambassador to North Korea. I have a short remark on North Korea and a question concerning Iran. North Korea, to me, appeared like a hedgehog. They want to preserve their own regime. That means their exploitative top group, and they do anything for it, including selling nuclear weapons. I'm convinced that in the last resort, they would also sell their nuclear weapons to the United States. This is why I believe that they did go nuclear in the first place. To quote some important official from an Asian country, he said, all the North Koreans want from America is their love, so they should give it to them. Now, if North Korea is a hedgehog, Iran is either would-be or soon-to-be hegemon. And in the environment, the disarmament environment of Germany, I was working in at the time, as from 2000, most people believed that Iran would want to go nuclear. We could maybe dissuade them from going nuclear, but it would be in their interest because they were in competition with Saddam or with Iraq in general. And I think they drew a lesson from the recent North Korean nuclear test. North Korea was told that their status of nuclear power would not be recognized. The North Koreans went on to say, now we are a nuclear power. And now they are a nuclear power. Wouldn't it be logical for the Iranians to say, we have a much stronger interest to be a nuclear power than North Korea? So just let us have it and treat us similar to the Indians and maybe the Pakistanis.
Well, I'm not on board to that idea. I don't know which is worse, North Korea or Iran getting the bomb. They're both very adverse developments for our security and for the security in the region. It's not just that they might use them. The simple possession by Iran of nuclear weapons emboldens Iran, reinforces this, I think, rather artificial inflation of their role in the Middle East and their image of themselves in the Middle East. On top of that, Iran does have connections to terrorist groups, so there is the possibility of diversion to terrorists. And on top of that, if you want to keep worried, governments change faster than arsenals do. So these bombs will be around long after the mullahs are gone. Who's next? How will that transition occur? We've already had the experience of one nuclear nation disintegrating into 15. You forget it now, but I'm sure Bob remembers that, and Graham remembers, that was a knuckle-whitening experience when the Soviet Union was collapsing and there were all these nuclear weapons around. So, count the ways, and you could say the same things about North Korea. It's bad in both cases. I'm not prepared to give up yet on the Iranian nuclear program, number one. I think we have some time to play that fish a little bit longer. But I do not think that there is a safe and way station which has Iran with nuclear weapons under current circumstances. You can imagine the circumstances changing. And people hearken back to the good old deterrent relationship with the Soviet Union. Well, first of all, as Graham once again knows, we had a few close calls during that relationship. And second, it ended with the collapse of one party. And third, I don't want to live with Kim Jong-il or Ahmadinejad in that kind of relationship. So I'm not on board to that. Maybe Bob is.
Let me just say, I do think I know which is worse. I think a nuclear-armed Iran is worse, and in part for the reasons that Ash cites. Iran has a very aggressive agenda. It is subject to an expansionist ideology in a key region of the world. It uses terrorism. I think the Secretary has said it's the central banker for international terrorism. It is working to kill our men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is working actively against the prospects for peace between Palestine and Israel. This is all in addition to pursuing nuclear weapons in violation of its commitments under the NPT. Iran with nuclear weapons is going to be an even greater adversary than Iran currently. And I'm one that does believe that there are true believers, including Ahmadinejad in Tehran. And I'm not willing to take a chance that we will, once Iran acquires nuclear weapons, find those moderates that we have been looking for since the revolution to take control and to be responsible. North Korea is, I think different. North Korea survives because of its isolation. And North Korea survives because of assistance that it gets, some would say extortion, payoffs that it gets from the outside. I think North Korea has to be told that they have a choice, just like the Libyans were told. You have to make a strategic choice. In the case of North Korea, that strategic choice is to give up their nuclear program, and the North Korean people will benefit. Or we will withhold all assistance, which holds the regime together. And if they don't get assistance from the outside, and this was why the six-party framework was so important, because that includes China. If they don't get assistance from the outside, they will go the way of Ceausescu and the other totalitarian regimes. This is a brutal regime, and if there is one sort of standout case for morality and international relations, it is North Korea, a state that is evil, a state that does have concentration camps, a state that does use starvation to kill not a few people, but millions of people. And I don't feel strongly about it other than that.
Okay, we're going to go into...
I can't resist saying that the upshot of that is that these evil people have nuclear weapons now, and that we have outsourced the constraining them to the Chinese, who are the people who supply them. Those two consequences of what you said make me very nervous.
Ash, they had nuclear weapons before, and they were pursuing a highly enriched uranium program, and we can't track that.
Wait, here's what they had. Here's what they had before.
How do we
They didn't have nuclear weapons
program
before.
and the
Somewhere
nuclear
in the
capability.
first Bush administration, not to blame them, I'm just trying to locate the time, 1989, North Korea got enough plutonium, we believe and still don't know, for 1 or 2 bombs. Then no more until 2004, when they got another, 8. So that goes from 1 or 2 to 8 or 10. That's a pretty big jump. For 8 long years of the much maligned agreed framework, which I forget what I wrote down what he called the agreed framework, the House of Cards. The House of Cards delivered 8 years with no more North Korean bombs. Now, you never win in non-proliferation, you only stall. And those 8 years, and there's much that can be said about the agreed framework, and it's gone now, so I'm not gonna mount a defense of it, but to call a House of Cards that produced that result, to call an agreement that produced that result a House of Cards is to say that I don't care how many nuclear weapons there are. And to call it a good thing that we have had this position over the last few years that has produced 8 more nuclear weapons is, again, not to count nuclear weapons. I count nuclear weapons, and it went from 2 to 10, and there's no way to dress that up.
All right.
And
I think
Ash,
we could probably...
I don't take issue with your math, okay? And it is better to have North Korea with 2 weapons than with 10 weapons. But North Korea with any weapons is a national security threat. Our objective has to be to eliminate the North Korean program. That's what we have to have as an outcome. And North Korea, while the agreed framework had put locks and seals, very neat little IAEA seals on the reprocessing facility and the reactor at Yongbyon, did not preclude North Korea from acquiring capabilities that could be used to enrich uranium, and we wouldn't know what the nature of the program is. And it just seems to me that, again, based on experience, not on hope, we've got to take into account the nature of this regime.
Okay, we're going to put that one to bed. In the next 1 minute, we're going to do the forum speed round. That means 1 question here, 1 question there. They will answer within 1 minute. The only stipulation is you can't ask anything about whether it was 2 or 10 nuclear weapons in North Korea. Go.
My name's Aaron Michael. Wow. My name's Aaron Michael. I'm a joint degree student here and over across the river at HBS. My question is, you had both mentioned before that America and Russia are reducing their number of nuclear weapons, while other countries, China, Pakistan, and so on, are raising their number of nuclear weapons. And Professor Carter, I think you said that once we go through one more round, you want to bring in other countries. And I'm wondering two things. First, is it possible is it realistic to expect that China, Pakistan, and these other countries will join in reducing their number of nuclear weapons? And two, you said it's not possible to end proliferation, but merely to stall it. So if we're trying to bring down the number of nuclear weapons to a minimum number, what is that minimum number? Well, how many nuclear weapons does a country need, and how will different countries view that question? Is it 1,000? Is it 500? Is it 100? Is it 1?
Ash, 30 seconds.
Well, I don't know whether others will join in arms control or not. They might not. But it doesn't make sense for us and Russia to just keep going as though we're the only two countries in the world, the way we did during the Cold War. That I agree completely with Bob about. I'm willing to take one more bite. I gather you're not, but at any rate, it doesn't make sense for us to go any further. How much is enough is a question that people have debated for a long time. I can't give you a good answer, a numerical answer to that. I do think that we can probably go, before we're in any kind of unsafe situation or questionable situation, we can go a little further. I think we have already concluded that and are in the process of doing that, and we might be able to go just a little bit further. But beyond that, we're getting to the point where others are, and I think we have to bring them in if we possibly can.
Great. Okay, last question.
Hi, my name is Roshan Paul, and I'm a second-year MPP student from India. This is a question I've asked a lot at the Kennedy School and haven't had a good answer to yet, so I'm hoping one of you can give me an answer. I don't believe that Iran and North Korea should have nuclear weapons, but I don't understand why the United States thinks it has the moral authority to ask anyone else not to have nuclear weapons. If I'm the leader of a country with any sense of national pride, I don't think I'd want the country with more nuclear weapons than anyone else, and the only country to have used nuclear weapons in the past, telling me what to do. So I'd like both of you to put yourselves in the shoes of a country like Iran or Egypt or any country with a long history and say why they would pay attention to the United States. They might pay attention to Germany or South Africa or Japan, but why the United States?
Sorry.
Just briefly, let me just say that on the question of one more bite. I think we probably will do one more bite. I think it's very important to continue the sort of transparency and confidence building measures and the other verification, or many of the other verification measures that have been established over the years with Russia, because it does provide predictability and a sense of insight. But I wouldn't want to get back into this nuclear relationship, sort of with Russia that really defines the very essence of how we relate to them. In terms of moral authority, I think this. The NPT, of course, is a legal document. It's a legal document that has been subscribed to by every nation except 3, India, Pakistan, and Israel. And countries did make the deal to give up their nuclear weapons potential. I think Ash has been exactly right in describing the reasons for that, the underlying reasons for that. And I think that we must continue to keep order, if you will, in the international system, and I think the NPT is seen as a means of doing that. Again, it's an important instrument, it's not the only one.
I agree with that. I always tell people, I'm asked this all the time, and I was when I was in office as well, Americans aren't any better than anybody else. And these weapons are too destructive ultimately for anybody to have. You just got to acknowledge that. And the first time one goes off in anger in the modern era, that'll become apparent to everyone. So there isn't a moral case here. This is a practical matter. And as a practical matter, it's not good if more countries get in the nuclear business. And and everybody's entitled to make up his or her own mind, and they shouldn't listen to us. They should listen to themselves. So you mentioned Egypt, for example. I had mentioned Mexico earlier on. And I would argue with an Egyptian friend or a Mexican friend that you don't want this. You don't want to live in that world. That's not a better world for you. So, you know, we find ourselves where we are, and it's not because we're better or wiser. Now, I think it's okay, and one of the reasons most countries in the world are fine to live with that is that I think that the United States has been responsible with its nuclear weapons and has been responsible in general, and I know people disagree from time to time, but with the way it has comported itself in the world and in an effort to create a fairer and juster and safer world in which countries and peoples aren't driven to this extreme.
Professor Carter, Ambassador Joseph, thank you all very much. Jason.
Mr. Chairman, can I say something? I wanted to say something about, this is a school of public service, and Bob Joseph is a great public servant. I told you he worked in the Pentagon, he worked in the State Department. We obviously disagree about North Korea. We didn't talk about a whole lot of other things that happened in recent years that have been very constructive and that Bob has been at the heart of. The Proliferation Security Initiative. He is now our negotiator on dealing with Russia and other countries to deal with nuclear terrorism worldwide. The Libya breakthrough was very important. So it's not like things are bad on all fronts. Things have been very good on some fronts, and we haven't had success, and who knows whether another administration would have had success. It's not that kind of issue. So you all are studying here in order to one day have a job like the job that Bob just vacated, and he's a great example of the kind of person in that job. And Bob, I wanted to salute you and thank you for your
Thank you
service.
very much. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you all very much.
And I also want to commend my students. These are former students of mine. They had the idea for this thing. If you like this, praise them. If you didn't like it, say it was a really great idea. Too bad you got these two bums. But anyway, they thought of it. I thought it was a pretty good idea, and it's a pleasure to be part of it.
Great job. Thank you. That's fun. So we disagree.